Greetings, it's Danielle Smith once again, president of Alberta Enterprise Group. We've been watching pretty closely some of the announcements coming out of Glasgow COP26. Biggest announcement, of course, with the Prime Minister saying that we are going to aim to get to net zero, obviously, by 2050. We know that, but giving the impression that oil and gas may be going the way of the dodo. I hope that's not what he means, because I do think that we have seen, and you have seen here, so much innovation happening in the oil and gas sector that would allow us to get to net zero. One area that we haven't talked about, but I think is going to firmly come into the crosshairs, is our farming sector. And part of the issue that we're talking about there centers around fertilizer and fertilizer costs, nitrogen, natural gas use as well. So I thought we should explore a little bit about that, because I suspect, actually, I know it to be true because I did a pre-interview with my guest, but I suspect that there's a lot of the public that doesn't know the amount of innovation that is taking in agriculture that once again puts us best in class in leading the world on trying to address these issues of emissions and lowering the amount of inputs that we use. And fortunately, we have a very knowledgeable guest today. Gunter Jochum is the president of the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association, and he farms in Manitoba. So he's got a Western perspective across the entire region. He joins us now to talk about all things environmental, but also give us a bit of an update on what's happening in the industry. Gunter, thanks so much for being with me today.
No problem. Thanks, Danielle. And, your introduction was maybe a little over the top, very knowledgeable. I'm a farmer, I work outside, president of the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association, but
and very, very modest. I know I've got a full page of notes from our conversation yesterday, so we'll let our listeners be the judge. Let's begin, though, by giving us a bit of a history, because I know that you said that you came from Germany, and that's going to be relevant to our discussion as well, because Germany and Europe is leading a lot of the discussion about what happens in farming. And so what is happening there, we have to be on guard for the same things to manifest here. So just tell us a little bit about how it is you came to be farming in Manitoba.
Right. My parents immigrated to Manitoba, Canada in 1980. I was 15 years old. And they came because my dad already saw the direction agriculture was going in Germany and in Europe. He was very troubled with government overreach, government getting involved and dictating how farmers should run their farms. And it's still a problem over there, a lot more than here. And what's really troubling right now is the Canadian government is trying to emulate that, what is happening in Germany, in Europe. And that is very troubling to us.
I want to talk about some of the policies in particular that you're seeing and where you think it is headed. But first, let's get a bit of a bird's eye view of what is happening in Western Canada, because I know that as a crop farmer, you've been in a number of different crops. So tell us what your farming operation looks like now. And I want to get a sense of how good business is, because we keep hearing about price inflation, but we also keep hearing about terrible drought conditions. So I want to get a sense of how the communities are doing in different parts of the region. But tell us a little bit about what your farming operation is like right now.
Right. We farm about 3,000 acres just west of Winnipeg, just on the edge of the Red River Valley. And it's a very productive area. We can really grow a wide range of crops. On our farm in the last 40 years, we've grown 12 different types of crops, from corn to soybeans to wheat, canola, malt, barley, peas, you name it, sunflowers, we've grown it. Currently, on our farm, we grow wheat, canola, oats, and soybeans.
It already tells me you got a lot more moisture than some of our farmers here. I always think of soybeans and oats and corn as being heavily water intensive. So do you have irrigation too, or is that just your natural conditions allow you to grow all that range?
No, on our farm, we don't have irrigation, but there is irrigation in Manitoba. The potato farmers rely heavily on irrigation because potatoes are grown on very light land. And so irrigation is very important. On our farm, we have very heavy clay-based soils, so good water retention. Water is actually more of a problem here, too much water rather than drought.
It always happens, hey? Oh, too much
Yeah,
water in all the wrong places and too little in all the wrong places as
absolutely.
well. So give me a sense of how farmers in Manitoba have done. I guess this is the issue. It's very localized. We do hear a lot of stories though about people having to resort to crop insurance this year because of drought. What's the general sense of how things went down? If you can just give us a bit of a look from Manitoba to Saskatchewan to Alberta.
Right. Every year across the prairies, there is the odd area. It's very regional that you have drought conditions or flooding conditions. It's never 100% perfect. This year, however, we've had pretty much a prairie-wide drought, and it was very devastating. I have some figures here from Stats Canada that production, canola, for example, down about 35% compared to last year. Wheat down in that 40 to 46%. Barley 47% down. Oats 47% down compared to last year. So you get the picture. And Stats Canada, these are numbers across the prairies. So it's not very localized.
That's incredible. I should mention British Columbia. You do have some members in BC, but just give us an idea of where they are situated.
Yeah, in British Columbia, we have members up in the Peace River area of British Columbia, and again, there was struggles there, and they've been struggling actually in the past with drought more so than usual. They're also maybe in a little bit more in an area where rainfall is a little more common, but the last few years it's been the exact opposite.
Give me a sense of what you're expecting now for how this is going to unfold over the next couple of years. I don't know if you easily can, because I'm accustomed to hearing in the beef industry that they are used to 7-year cycles, 7 years up, 7 years down. When we get into this kind of drought, does it tend to persist for a number of years, or is it really hard to predict?
Oh, that's very hard to predict. Okay. I think in my farming career right here in Manitoba on my farm, we've been through 1980 when we came was a drought. 88 was a drought for my farm. 2005 was extreme wet, and we only got half the farm seeded. 2011, we had the Assiniboine River flood for all season, and we only got half the crop seeded. And then this year, 2021, was devastating drought. We are well into crop insurance numbers, and not too far away from me. It was so bad that whole fields got written off. They never even got harvested.
Wow.
So it's overall, Danielle, it hasn't been bad. Like in the last 4 decades, no, drought is not a huge concern. It is a concern every time it happens, but I won't go into 2022 here thinking, oh my gosh, there's going to be a drought. Farmers are always eternally optimistic. So,
I love to hear. You have to be to be able to take on that kind of risk. It almost sounds to me like you get a number of good years punctuated every 6 or 7 years by either too much water or drought. And so I won't presume that next year is going to be a replication of this year. So that's good to know. But tell me, do the prices compensate for the lower production? I want to understand what's happening. Let's talk about the main products. Obviously, your Wheat Growers Association. So let's talk about what's happened in the pricing on wheat and canola and barley.
Right. Prices in general this year have actually, from a year ago, doubled. In cases, more than doubled. So from that aspect, it's been very good. However, if you don't have any grain to sell, it doesn't really matter how high the price is, right? Last year, we were selling oats, for example, anywhere from $3.50 to $4.20 a bushel. right now I have bids arriving at my yard looking for oats $10 a bushel.
Oh,
But it's fantastic price. I haven't got any. So I haven't got any for sale. It doesn't matter if it would go to $20 a bushel. Wouldn't change a thing for me this year. However, those price increases, the deferred months or for next fall, we're seeing a nice price bump as well. And we could forward contract. But we're still a little bit well, not just a little bit, we're still in the throes of drought. We have a water deficit in the subsoil. And so farmers are very reluctant to forward contract. The other reason is farmers had trouble filling contracts this year. And so because farming has been very good, yields have been quite consistent and rising steadily over the last 4 decades. And we were getting pretty confident in forward contracting part of our production. And this year, large areas had no harvest, and so they couldn't deliver on those contracts. So farmers are very hesitant.
What's the consequence of that, of not being able to deliver on a forward contract?
Well, you have to buy out the contract. And we ran into some resistance with some of the grain buyers, the grain companies, when farmers were starting to get worried in July that they were not going to have a crop. Crop insurance said, okay, we'll write off your crop. You can cut it for green feed for cattle farmers. And so we went as farmers to the grain companies, said, hey, we would like to buy back this contract. You have to somehow get out of the contract. And some companies point blank told us, no, that's not going to be an option. And that was very hard to take. And so we've been fighting there on behalf of farmers, talking to the grain companies, talking to the Western Grain Elevator Association, and so on. So it's been a struggle.
Does crop insurance help cover some of the liability associated with that, or not completely?
No. Crop insurance is pretty much production insurance. They just look at what you produce, and there is a price attached to the price is set in the spring, what crop insurance pays for a bushel of wheat or a bushel of canola. And then each individual farm's coverage is determined by their past performance.
So if I'm seeing this, so the coverage is really just to cover input costs, and whatever you've negotiated a contract for the sale, that's sort of the increment that the farmer is going to be out?
So crop insurance only covers it on our farm, for example, for canola. Our average canola yields over the years have been around 30 bushel an acre. And so crop insurance will cover me up to 30 bushel an acre at a set price. Now, if I harvest 25, I get 5 bushel an acre coverage at that set price. If I contracted 30 bushel an acre with a grain buyer and I cannot deliver a single bushel, the grain buyer says, you owe me for that 30 bushel an acre grain. So you have to pay them. You have to pay the grain buyer. And that is all fine. That's part of doing business. We accept that. But when we talked to the grain buyer and said, hey, we need to get out of these contracts because we don't have the grain, and they said no. They said, some of them said, let's wait for harvest to start. Maybe there's some there and you can deliver against the contract. Well, the market realized there was no grain, or there was going to be huge shortages. And so the grain price increased into harvest and has been increasing steadily since. So the market differential is getting wider between what we contracted at and what the buyout is now. So for some farms, it was tens of thousands of dollars more because the grain buyer wasn't ready to, wasn't willing to buy out, have us buy back our contracts. when
How
we
do you think that's going to get resolved? I mean, when you end up with that kind of differential, does the farmer just eat it, or is there
oh yeah,
some way of yeah?
yeah. No, we pay that, and that is not the problem. The problem was that the grain buyers weren't ready to um, make that buyout happen when the farmers asked for it. And so we're really worried that that possibly the government will step in to try and rectify that. The grain contracts have been kind of heavily sided towards the grain buyers because they write the grain contracts. They write all their little stipulations in the fine print, and it's heavily favored towards the grain buyers. But we farmers want that changed a little bit. We want
Okay.
a little more even playing field. So
Well,
we're working away at that.
well, that helps explain why there'd
Yeah.
be reluctance then to sign forward contracts
Yeah.
next year. But the problem remains is that the world was expecting almost twice as much production out of our farmers than we're getting, and I'm trying to understand what that's going to mean to the consumer. So let's talk about internationally. What does that mean for export markets? What do we you know what? Before I go there, now that you know where I'm going, we don't often talk about pricing on grain products. We're very much aware of what WTI is and WCS and what natural gas prices are. You've given us some price points on oats. Would you mind going us through on canola and wheat and barley, just so that we understand what it was a year ago versus what it is today, so that we can get some price points in our mind about where the market's at?
Right. Canola was trading around $10 to $12 a bushel last fall. And right now I can sell to our local crusher here for as high as $23 a bushel. So it almost doubled. Oats, the same thing. I gave you the example on oats, $4, $4.20 to now $10. Wheat, same thing. The elevator called me the other day, and we were selling some wheat for $12.50 a bushel. When last year we, at the low end, we sold around $7. At the high end, we sold about $8 a bushel. So massive increases, and it's very consistent across what we grow here in Western Canada. Pulses, it's exactly the same thing. It's about a 70 to 100% increase in commodity prices.
I don't want to leave without you getting barley prices, because I need to know what's going to happen to my microbrew beer. So what's happening on barley prices?
Barley price is exactly the same thing. Barley has gone up 100%. Yes.
Okay. So then let's talk about what this means for the consumer. And we'll talk about export market as well as domestically. I mean, in some ways, we're a little desensitized to food prices because they have been so low for so long, and they are a smaller portion of the household budget than they used to be years ago, just because we've gotten relatively wealthier. And so what are we going to see with these kinds of price escalations and the shortages you're talking about? Is it likely to manifest in the fact I don't know, you go to the grocery store and you're not able to get wheat, or producers aren't able to get the barley they need to produce their beer? Are we in danger of having shortages in Canada?
So in Canada, I don't think we will be in danger of running out of grains to make bread, to make beer, and so on. And the danger here is to say, oh, look, the farmer is getting so much more for what he produces, and this means, we get twice of what we had a year ago, so food prices are going to explode. However, I don't know, in a bottle of beer, the amount of barley that's in there is maybe 23 cents a bottle. So even if it goes up to 40 cents of barley worth in a bottle of beer, the real cost increases aren't from what we grow. The real cost increases are from all the other hands that touch our products that we grow until they get onto the consumer's table.
Okay.
So we have to be careful about blaming the farmer for the price increases. We're
I think
primary producers, and we are at the very bottom of the totem pole. Like,
yeah. No, I think it's such a great point. So I think that brings it into perspective. You might see a price increase, but you shouldn't expect a doubling of the retail price of your products as a result of the things we're talking about. What about flour, though? I know a number of people have gotten into baking bread, and I have a restaurant, and so there was a period of time where we were worried we might not be able to get yeast because it was flying off the shelves as well. So what do we expected to see there?
well, it again, we should have plenty of flour. We should have plenty of food in Canada. Food insecurity in Canada, as far as availability, should not be a major stumbling block. However, food prices will increase. Our grocery bills increase. I mean, used to be able to go to Costco with a cart full, it'd be $400. Now, for $400, oh my gosh, you can almost carry it out in one of those little baskets rather than a push cart. So, but again, it's not the primary producer who's at fault here. And there will be other shortages because of supply chain issues. Where does most of our food come from? The vegetables in our off season come from California. So again, it's trade related, it's supply chain related. Transportation costs are going through the roof. Carbon tax on transportation and whatnot. And now with the government, with Canada being the only jurisdiction really that has a price on carbon, a carbon tax, even though Biden says he will put one on for the US as well, I doubt that Congress will let him. So I don't think we'll see a lot of other countries apply a carbon tax to their economies. And so they will be able to produce whatever they produce a lot cheaper than we can here in Canada. And then to implement, I forget what they call it, an equalization thing at the border to make up for that carbon tax will again just be a hindrance to our economy. And it will trickle down to the everyday consumer.
I want to talk more about the specific impacts that the various carbon taxes and other greenhouse gas pricing is going to have on you. But before I leave the question of how this plays out internationally, I want to get your thoughts on that. So you said we don't have food insecurity issues in Canada. That's great, but we are also a major exporter of a lot of our grain products, and so the rest of the world relies on us to fill that gap. Are you concerned that we might see food insecurity or food shortages elsewhere?
Absolutely. And food insecurity within Canada. So there isn't a food insecurity. There's maybe there will be a food insecurity amongst the lower middle class and the poor people because they will not be able to afford the food that's available. You know what I mean? Like food prices are going up, way going up. CERB money or EI is not going to help them to get food that's grown with these excessive costs of a carbon tax and whatnot and supply chain issues. So that's the food insecurity in Canada. Now, food insecurity abroad, it will be again the same thing. We're an exporting nation. Up to 85% of what I grow is exported. This year, lots of our production will stay at home. The canola industry, for example, is very short. Canola is down 50% in production. And Canada has a huge canola crushing industry, and they will use up all the canola domestically. So we won't have very much canola seed to export. And that could potentially upset trade relations with our regular customers. Potentially. It remains to be seen. So yeah.
If those get disrupted, is there anyone else to fill the breach? Because that's what you always worry about is if you can't meet the supply, one of our competitors is going to. But are Are other countries in the same boat as we are, or is there somebody who's really going to benefit from the fact that we're a bit out of the game this year?
Australia is a grower of canola, so they will step up and they will benefit. And then if canola seed and canola oil gets too expensive, people will just use something else. So substitution will happen to soy oil, sunflower oil, palm oil. But palm oil production is down as well. So that again plays into why all our commodities are priced a lot higher right now.
And so talking about next year, you think, okay, well, we can make it up next year, but now we have all these additional costs layered onto our producers that your
Absolutely.
competitors don't have. So let's talk about a few of those if we can. If you could explain, maybe I'm asking you a question you don't know the answer to, but maybe you can. I just remember seeing a major protest in the Netherlands where farmers were very concerned about some new kind of nitrogen tax, and so they drove their tractors to the parliament to protest. And so I thought, if that's happening there, we better pay attention to that because they're likely to adopt the same policies here. Are you able to shed some light on what has happened in Europe, and then we can see how much of that is being adopted here?
Absolutely. So Europe is going a little more green, and so they are putting 25 to 30% fertilizer rate reduction on their farmers. And our government seemed to like that idea, and they are toying with the idea, and they're bringing in legislation to do the same thing here in Canada. And the Western Canadian wheat growers are absolutely opposed to that type of strategy. Less fertilizer means we're growing less crop. So we could say, and farmers are already working on this, well, we can achieve this fertilizer reduction through better technology, right? The way we apply fertilizer, using nitrogen inhibitors so that nitrogen doesn't gas off, volatilize, gets lost, and actually stays in the soil so the plants can utilize it. We're utilizing lots of technology like variable rate application, which means we make maps of our fields, and there could be up to 10 different zones within that field. And each zone gets the right amount of fertilizer depending on soil tests that we do. And so we have equipment as it drives across, it applies the right amount of fertilizer at the right location at the right time. And we can utilize fertilizer better and possibly achieve the reductions by utilizing this. The problem with the government is the way they account for those reductions. They want an actual tonnage reduction because it's very easy to say, well, last year, let's say, just for an example, Canada used 100,000 tons of nitrogen fertilizer. We want a 30% reduction, so this year they only get 70,000 tons. Well, that's the wrong approach. It's a very easy approach to put it that way because it's easy to account for, but then it achieves the wrong outcome.
So let me then see what the better way of doing it. That's quite amazing. I should just sort of underscore when you told me that yesterday, I couldn't believe that the technology had advanced to that point where you can give that kind of specialized application on a plot by plot basis. That's quite remarkable about how the technology is responding. But I guess it begs the question is, if an overall tonnage reduction is not the right answer, what is the measure they should be looking at? Should it be certain amount of fertilizer per acre? Should it be, you tell me, I'm not going to guess. What should be the measure that they would look at if they were being reasonable about it and accommodating for the fact that innovation is addressing a lot of this issue?
Personally, I think it should be the amount of grain produced per unit of fertilizer that we use. And if we can maximize that, that is the right way of going about it. I mean, we can add fertilizer until we're blue in the face and the crop will take it in. But there comes a point where the efficiency of the fertilizer use of the plant versus the yield gain becomes inverse and actually goes backwards. And so we don't want to go there because fertilizer is very expensive, and it has gotten more expensive. It's gotten also twice as expensive as last year. So farmers aren't really interested in applying fertilizer carelessly. We want to make sure we get the biggest bang for our buck, so we get the most return, most efficient return from the crops we grow versus the fertilizer we apply. So it really boils down to that, but it is kind of hard to measure, and the government has a hard time finding those values and presenting them to the world. So all the countries that are over in Glasgow right now at COP26, they put out a report every year. It's called the NIR, the National Inventory Report, and it documents the greenhouse gas emissions across all industries, what the consumer releases, what plants use to grow, what plants store, sequester, and so on. And the government uses these figures, and they base their policy on these figures from the NIR. However, when you read the fine print of the NIR, it says a lot of the numbers in there are accurate within 40 to 60% of the time. So to me, that means it's just like flipping a coin. That those are pretty vague numbers all of a sudden, and nobody ever talks about this. So going via those numbers and what we can do out in the field, the government has a hard time saying, oh, okay, well, we could use that technology, but boy, that really doesn't give us very concrete numbers. Even though scientists, our agronomists, we all know it works. We have the proof, and but the people in Ottawa want it a lot simpler.
Well, I hope you can make the case for using a better measure, because it does make sense. I mean, if we can get more and more productive using less and less fertilizer, that's kind of the holy grail. It allows for us to have greater food production to feed the world and still be able to meet some of those targets. So it seems like that should be what they strive for. I want to ask you a little bit more, though, about your industry, because I'm always struck by the fact that when the ENGOs take a look at farming or ranching, they only ever look at the greenhouse gas equation on one side of it. And it seems to me that crops do a lot of sequestration. Not only do they capture the CO2 from the atmosphere, but they've got root systems that bring it into the soil. And I'm presuming it's the same as with fescue and ranching, that it gets deep into the soil to fill the microbes and it stays there. So there's a lot of sequestration that happens even though you're taking a crop off. And I don't know that we really ever quantify that or offset it against the other side of the equation. Am I onto something here?
Yes, you are. And again, it gets pretty fuzzy at times with those numbers. And sequestration and storage, that they're two different things. So carbon sequestration, that is when carbon gets stored in the soil and it actually stays there for long periods. Carbon storage, there's short-term storage. When we grow a crop, the crop that we take off, canola or wheat, that the canola or wheat, the products that we grow are made up of carbon mostly and other materials, but there's a lot of carbon in there, and that is essentially stored in that crop. So farmers do store a lot of carbon away, and the carbon comes from carbon dioxide because plants take up carbon dioxide, release oxygen, and with that carbon they build grain. And so farmers do that. Mother Nature does that. Sun, fertilizer, water, soil, and boom, you've got carbon stored away. It doesn't take a big machine to do it. The problem is the grain is getting used up. And so every time it gets used, that carbon is released again. But all the grain that we grow in Canada, Canadians do not release all that carbon that's stored in that grain. So again, Canada is actually a net storer of carbon.
That makes total sense.
It's consumers around the world that release it.
That makes total sense. Now that if you've described that a lot of our, of that 85% in a normal year of our product is exported, we should be getting some kind of net credit for the fact that we provide that storage service. And then it's others who are doing the release, and they should be the ones who have to account for and offset that release. But why don't we, I guess this is just it. I always feel like when we go into these Glasgow negotiations that we never put our best foot forward. That is a brilliant argument to make, but I've never heard it made. Is it that politicians don't know what they don't know, or is it that they've rejected the argument?
Well, that's interesting to know. So it's called COP26 over in Glasgow. That means they've met now for the 26th time. They always make great promises of what they're going to do and how they're going to help the environment and all this, and how we need saving from a climate catastrophe. I don't know. I look outside and I don't see a catastrophe. Yes, weather happens. There's hurricanes, there's tornadoes, there's droughts, there's floods. But honestly, you talk to some scientists and they will say, well, it hasn't really increased. Some are saying yes, others are saying no, it hasn't really increased. So you take your pick who you believe, right? It's interesting to note that most of the people in Glasgow are politicians, not scientists. They're politicians and policymakers. There's some farmers there who actually don't even get to speak, but they're there anyways. I don't know how they got there, who paid for them to go there. But anyways, the thing is, I don't know, the scientists aren't there. And you will find scientists that say, okay, global warming is man-made. And you'll also find scientists that say, well, global warming has more to do with the sun rather than humans. That remains to be debated, and it will be debated forever. The science is not settled. That's not how science works.
That may well be, but the politics is settled.
Correct. The politics is settled, and therein lies the problem. So it's become a popularity contest. Who can yell the loudest and say, oh, look what we're doing, right? Trudeau loves to say, hey, look what we're doing. We're going to cap the oil and gas industry. Next, we're going to hit the farmers, because those are the low-hanging fruit, right? There's only 2% of us farmers. That's very few votes that he upsets by putting caps on our industry. Oil and gas industry, same thing. You know, there's very few people working in there. It's a huge economic driver, but we can damage it easily and win a popularity contest. And
so here's, I guess, the question is that it seems no matter who you elect, every one of the political parties, including the Conservatives, are now looking to 2050 to be net zero on emissions. And I'm curious to know, is that an achievable target in your sector? We've talked about a few of the innovations. I suppose we actually already are net negative based on the measure that you just gave us. Maybe I can get you to talk a little more about sequestration. So we have that storage aspect,
right?
And then we export 85%. So consumers abroad are the ones consuming it, but we've provided the storage service. Does your industry also have that sequestration aspect that we talked about?
We do. And that's because farming practices, especially on the prairies, have changed. When we immigrated here in 1980, a third to half of the farmland across the prairies was still summer followed, which means every other year there was only a crop grown every other year. And in between the crop growing years, it was summer followed, either worked or then eventually moved into chem fallow. In other words, nothing was grown there, which inherently is very bad because now you're not sequestering anything, right? The soil just lays there and does nothing. You need plants to grow in order to sequester or store carbon away out of the atmosphere. And scientists, agronomists realized this is not a good way to farm. And so we've gone away from there and went to a system where we grow a crop every year. And then we changed the way we grow those crops. We went from regular tillage, where we did tillage in the fall, tillage in the spring, and then seed a crop, to minimum till, which means there was maybe a little bit of tillage done in the fall and then direct seeded in the spring with no extra tillage before the drill. And some farmers even go as far as zero till. They don't till the land at all. So what happens in the soil, every time you till the ground, some carbon is released, and it destroys that carbon that's in the soil. So anything you have sequestered there leaves. And the government actually has data where it has shown from 1980 up until 2011. I think they kind of quit monitoring it after that. But there's data, beautiful maps that show a rise in organic matter across the prairies. And that is just because farmers changed the way they farmed. And the rise in organic matter builds from carbon. So carbon was stored, organic matter increased, proves right there that we were doing the right thing at the right time.
What frustrates me about this conversation is that we keep hearing the goal is net zero by 2050. And to me, net means you look at all the ways in which you increase CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, and then you offset it with all the ways in which you're reducing CO2 emissions, or you're storing, or you're sequestering. And so if I do that calculation, we shouldn't be targeting your industry at all with any additional measures. But as we're talking, it begins to appear like the politicians are not aiming for net zero. They're aiming for actual zero. And it strikes me, if actual zero is going to be the target, we can't produce enough food if we get down to zero fertilizer use. I'm just wondering where this is heading.
It's got me. Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you just said. I actually saw a neat little chart this morning. In 1980, the human population was 4.4 billion people. In 2020, it's 7.75 billion. Airline passengers in 1980, there was 640 million people that flew around in 1980. Airline passengers in 2019, before the pandemic struck, 4.3 billion people flew in 2019. Cattle population, 1980, 1.05 billion. Cattle population in 2021, 1 billion. So fewer cattle. So and the same with farming. So let's talk about the pandemic a little bit. What changed during the pandemic is airline traffic went virtually to zero across the globe. Commuter traffic was cut in half or less because people worked from home. What happened in the ag industry? Farmers went out, planted a crop, used as much fertilizers, seed, diesel fuel, and their equipment like they did in 2019. The transportation industry, it kept moving because we needed to move all that grain. So, and scientists said, I heard that last spring, that the air was actually cleaner. There was less pollutants in the air at the end of 2020 than a year earlier. And they said it went straight back to regular traffic, and it had nothing to do with farming. The farm industry didn't change. So why are we attacking farmers that farmers need to do better? Farmers need to cut to meet greenhouse gas emissions. We're not the problem. Farmers are not the problem.
I haven't seen all the stats on this, but I gather there's 400 planes that flew into Glasgow, and that Canada's delegation was 300 people, all to get together and have a gab fest about how to put more regulations on your industry.
Well, and apparently Canada had the largest delegation there, which again begs the question. We have 33, 35 million people. The US has 350 million people, and their delegation was smaller than the Canadian one.
I hear what you're saying.
China and India didn't even go.
So they could have perhaps had a few people go in by Zoom and saved a few of those emissions. Let's talk. I need you to unbundle this a little bit, because again, I think there's a lot of people who we take for granted. The food appears on our table, and the flour and the beer appears on the grocery store and liquor store shelves. But I want to understand a little more about the issue, this central issue of fertilizer, because I interviewed someone a few years ago about the process that we developed to allow us to capture nitrogen from the air. And if we hadn't been able to do that, his contention was that with the normal amount of nitrogen that's available for our use in the soil, we'd only be able to feed 3 billion people on the planet. Because of this technological innovation, we're up to 7.6 billion people, and we could probably increase it more. That's why I get very, very concerned when governments step in and say they want us to use less fertilizer, because underlying that is a direct relationship to how many people we can feed. So tell me a little more about where we get our fertilizer from, so that we can see what kind of policies the government is imposing on you. Because I admittedly, we hear a lot about potash, but obviously there are other ways that you get the nutrients that you need. So again, I want to see what's happening on the supply chain on those fronts. So can we just talk that through a little bit? First of all, tell me about potash, because I know that is such a great product for Saskatchewan. And are we seeing any supply chain issues there?
Potash is produced in Saskatchewan, or lots of it, is one of the main players in the world. And supply chain issues, I don't believe there's huge supply chain issues there. However, Danielle, honestly, on the potash side of things, I'm not 100% sure, because on my farm, I don't use a lot of potash at all. Our soil has plenty. So I don't want to say anything that's not quite right.
Then let's talk about the products that you use. How many different products can you use on your land? Do you have a lot of different choices? I'm just trying to get a sense of.
So the main fertilizer that the government is looking at in reducing here is nitrogen, and the one that's so easy to produce right now because of the Haber-Bosch process that was developed over 100 years ago, and it really revolutionized farming, because all of a sudden nitrogen, one of the major components in plant food, became readily available, and that's what we're talking about, and that's what lent to the explosion in agriculture, the explosion in food production, you might say.
Can you describe the Haber-Bosch process at all? I'm not a technical person.
So I don't know it exactly, but the main ingredients are air and natural gas. You need a cheap energy source, and so that was natural gas. And then they literally pull nitrogen out of the air. I mean, the air is made up out of close to 80% of nitrogen, so there's lots of nitrogen around. And the Haber-Bosch process, which uses energy and pulls it out of the air, and you have nitrogen.
So it's not that the nitrogen is a greenhouse gas that causes warming, because as you said, it's the dominant atom in our atmosphere. It's the fact that this process to create fertilizer uses natural gas. So they're really targeting the natural gas.
Yeah. So they're targeting natural gas, and fertilizer prices in the last few months have absolutely exploded. And that is because of a lack of natural gas, actually. And There's several things, but natural gas prices went up, and I don't know if there was a disruption in natural gas production. There doesn't seem to be new natural gas wells coming online, and so it's just snowballing. And the price of natural gas is going up. It's a major ingredient in making nitrogen fertilizer, and some of these fertilizer companies were running on very razor thin margins for years and years and years. And when natural gas went up, they just said, well, we're just not going to produce nitrogen, without good cause. So they shut down plants. They just waited it out. And of course, natural gas did not come down in price. And now the price of fertilizer has gone up dramatically because none was produced. We came into the fall season here where a lot of fertilizer is applied across the North America. And it all of a sudden, there seemed to be supply chain issues. There seemed to be supply issues, actually. Where people were getting afraid there won't be enough nitrogen. And it's not just a North American issue, it's a global issue. So, here we are. Fertilizer prices through the roof. And supply.
You've been really good at giving us sort of what it was last year versus what it was this year. Do you have those numbers at your fingertips so that we can get a sense of just how much they've escalated?
Yeah, last year there's 3 different types of nitrogen fertilizer. Rather than giving you a price on each nitrogen that's available, I'll give you a per pound price, and it's sort of an average. Well, last year I was buying for my farm under 50 cents a pound of actual nitrogen, the cost of actual nitrogen. I bought some yesterday and it was $1.04 a pound. Oh. And the dealer actually said that it will go probably to $1.14. And then yesterday, Russia, a major nitrogen producer, said they will not export extra nitrogen. So they put a moratorium on for 6 months of no nitrogen exports. So our North American dealers actually pulled all their bids, their live bids. I could not get a price yesterday on nitrogen if I wanted to buy nitrogen, just because of those news that Russia was not going to export any nitrogen.
I'm afraid to ask you what you think the prices are going to be after the end of today. Is there going to be what's the upper limit that you can see nitrogen prices going to? Is there any futures market you can look at to get an idea of that?
Yes, you can, but there is no cash price available. Wow. Because they will not quote you a price.
Right.
In about a month ago, it was about a month ago, 6 weeks maybe, I tried to get a quote on liquid fertilizer, and my supplier said, well, we have a little bit of a problem because the plant in Brandon is not producing any fertilizer, and they don't know when they will start up again. They have in the meantime, and so there was no price available, there was no product available. We did end up getting product, and we were able to price some more, but this is how it's unfolding right now. So it's a real concern.
It's a major concern. I wonder if, you often hear that some of the errors that get made were not hedging on certain products. And I'm guilty of this too. I signed up for an electricity fixed price contract, but I was persuaded, we've got so much natural gas and the prices are so low, you don't need to lock in. So I'm not going to judge that the grain companies appear not to have done that. But is that what it comes down to? Is that if they'd done some hedging, then they would have been able to maintain their prices. But I guess this is the
But
question.
even hedging, you can only hedge so far in advance, so it's not indefinitely,
Right.
and it just seemed to be a perfect storm coming together, and the fertilizer manufacturers are in no hurry to overproduce.
My goodness.
They are really working hand to mouth.
So how does this get solved? Because I guess they would have been accustomed to buying gas at $2 a
Right.
gigajoule, and now we're, if I'm using the right, or if it's an MCF, I think is what it is.
Mhm.
And so now we're up, I think, in the order of $6 per MCF. So we've seen a threefold increase. You kind of wonder what it's going to take to break the logjam. Is there any analysis out there about when you say they're in no hurry, what kind of pricing are they looking for?
I really don't know. There is a market analyst who only looks at fertilizer, and I get feedback from him every day, and he's really at a loss for words. He said, I have no idea where this is going. I don't know how expensive fertilizer will get. He hates to make a prediction. So you asking me where is this going? I have no idea, Danielle. It's a little bit frightening. I know at least a third of the farmers have not priced any fertilizer for next year. So it is worrisome for them, but at the same time, they look back in 2008, we had a bit of a crunch as well. It was sort of inflationary runaway with prices, and fertilizer prices were extremely high in the summer and into the fall. And the people that didn't buy that year lucked out, because by the following spring, the fertilizer price had almost come back to where it used to be, sort of normal. And so the people that have bought, the farmers that had bought in the fall, had to pay the big price. The farmers that waited till spring actually were okay. However, this analyst says this year it's a lot different. It's a different squeeze that's at play. There's different forces at play. And he says, I have no idea how it's going to be solved.
Gunter, if you say that you're frightened, now you've got me frightened. So I want to know what the solution is here. It almost seems, I think maybe people need to understand how the fertilizer market works, because in a normal market operation, somebody would say, hey, I think I can make money at this. And they would set up their own Haber-Bosch process and start producing fertilizer, and we would solve it through free enterprise. You wouldn't just have a big plant sitting there dormant. So why can't that happen?
Oh, I don't think you build a $150 million fertilizer plant overnight. And I don't even know what they cost. 150, maybe it's $500 million to build a plant. I have no idea. The problem is there's only 3 big players worldwide. So that is part of the problem as well. So we don't have good competition. And it's very easy for them to, I'm going to use that word, collude, and say, hey, let's just step away from the table and see what happens, right? Honestly, that is what's happening as well.
So I don't, can you, who are the 3 players that we're looking at? You mentioned Russia. Are they one of the big players, or are you talking about 3 private sector company players?
I think there's 3 private sector players, and then there's only a few that produce enough, a couple of nations that produce enough to export. So Russia is one of them. Canada produces a lot of nitrogen, and there's so few players. That is the problem.
So what role, I mean, normally, this is what I got taught in my economics classes, is that part of government's job is to prevent monopolies from using their market position to create these kinds of outcomes. So I never like to ask for government intervention. I like to think markets will work. But if we've got a situation where you do have an oligopoly, what is the role for government to play? Here's the problem. I mean, everything we've set up to this point suggests that the federal government doesn't want to see an increase in fertilizer production.
Right.
So they're not motivated to solve this problem. But you still need to get the product. People still need to eat. I'm just wondering what's got to give here. If we had a politician or a government that was keen to solve this problem, how would they solve it?
Huh. You're asking me questions that I have no answer to, honestly.
I guess the thing I would think is that you could get the government to step up perhaps to subsidize the input price and say, okay, well, if you are prepared to produce, if gas is at $4 an MCF, then we'll provide the subsidy for that extra $2 or $3. We'll give you some price certainty. That would be the thing. If that's what is needed as a motivation to kickstart things, that's one thing that comes to mind. But I would think that we have a government that is charging a carbon tax on natural gas, so they'd be disinclined to do that.
Yeah, I think our governments and European governments are actually absolutely fine with there being less nitrogen fertilizer available. So I don't think we'll get any pull from them. The other thing is, subsidizing. I don't like that word.
No, I don't either.
Like that concept. The Western Canadian wheat growers don't like that concept. It's very bad for business because it creates some artificial market that can spiral out of control and actually, instead of helping, hinder the economy.
All right. Do you think we're going to get to a point, though, because we've been talking about the price increase? Do we get to a point next year where we have shortages of fertilizer?
So my local fertilizer dealer doesn't think there will be shortages. Actually, if farmers are prepared to store some and look after their needs early on. If the farmers that wait till the last minute, right at seeding time, he figured there could potentially be problems for them, for those individuals.
So we'll start seeing that, what, May? Or
yeah, that would be April going into May. And the reason is because there will be logistics problems getting product in fast enough and to be able to distribute it. Okay. So that's the only way there will be shortages. Around here, most of the farmers, like I said, right now it's about a third of the farmers that haven't done anything, and the other 2/3 have at least some of their needs covered. So I think we will be okay, but you never know. Like, this world is so crazy in the last couple of years. Saying, what do you think will happen? I don't know. Honestly, I do not know.
It's very true. It's been turned upside down. So we may have to do another check-in with you as we get into April, May. Ildiko is challenging me a bit here, saying you need to get an expert to talk about the negative effects of nitrogen runoff. It's a lot more than attacking natural gas producers. So it may, I guess, because this is being talked about in the context of COP26 in Glasgow, I think the motivation for what they're doing to you is more on the issue of greenhouse gas emissions and natural gas. But yes, there are also other effects. And could you address this issue of nitrogen runoff? Is that one of the motivations? Absolutely.
So nitrogen runoff is a big problem. And that is actually how Europe started out their reduction in nitrogen fertilizer, is because of runoff. Europe is a huge user of nitrogen fertilizers. They get bigger yields than us, but they use a tremendous amount of nitrogen. And so the government there is curbing the use and getting them to use less nitrogen fertilizer because of the runoff issue. In Canada, the reduction is purely a greenhouse gas reduction based. That's why they're doing it. However,
and is that because of that more surgical application that you were talking about, that we've developed mechanisms to to try to reduce the excess amount of fertilizer added, or what else have we done to ensure that we don't have the same runoff problems?
So there's still some runoff problems even in Canada, because there's still some farmers, not very many, that just broadcast their fertilizer on. There's on our farm we use nitrogen stabilizers, so that is a coat on the fertilizer that prevents it from gassing off or running off per se. It keeps it in the soil. The same thing on our farm. Most of our fertilizer is applied right at seeding time. So as the crop grows, it's readily available immediately, and it's incorporated right at seeding time. We used to apply a lot in the fall, most of the nitrogen actually, and we've gone away from that.
So it seems to me we can apply best practices across all farming operations as an alternative way of achieving what the government wants to achieve. And in fact, some of the practices we have here, exporting those practices to the world would make a big difference.
Yes, it would. And there's other parts in the world that utilize some of those practices as well. And it's working very well. It's trying to get everybody else on board, even within Canada. Sometimes farmers have a hard time changing. Sometimes it's costly to change because it needs a wholesale equipment change. And that needs to be financed somehow. So if the government is interested, there could be incentives there to change into better technology, rather than saying, no, let's just cut this out. Because cutting the fertilizer tonnage isn't going to solve the runoff problem if a little bit less is still applied wrong, right? So 4R nutrient management needs to be applied.
That makes so much sense. Now, here's the only problem. Would we be able to get all of the equipment if we did that kind of wholesale change that you're talking about? Has the semiconductor issue and shortage affected farm equipment as much as it's affected sort of the retail auto industry?
Absolutely. Yeah. The last year and a half have been terrible. When equipment breaks down, especially new technology equipment that uses semiconductors, chips, you name it, they are all somewhere in a container in the North Pacific or in some port or in China still, because most of them are made there, and that supply chain is broken. And if they cannot get that fixed, it will just get worse rather than better. And so some farmers have experienced some real issues and problems this summer dealing with parts shortages. If some of their equipment broke down, sometimes the equipment sat for 4 weeks, not moving, broken, especially if it's newer technology equipment. Older equipment that you fix with a hammer and a welder, you can work with that, but it's a real problem.
Well, truly, sure. And to do the kind of precision application you're talking about, you need the newer equipment.
Yeah.
Okay, you're full of bad news today. Let's see if we can find some good news before we end off here. I don't want people being in a state of panic. What about getting product to market? I mean, I think we've all watched what is happening in the California ports, and we've seen Florida Governor Ron DeSantis say, hey, look, we got a lot of ports, we're open 24/7, you can offload here. But there does seem to be a real problem on shipments, and it seems to be twofold. One is the inefficiency of ports, and I'm not sure I understand everything behind that. Maybe you can tell me. But the second is the containers for transport. So on the first one, is there any danger that you're not going to be able to get the container transport that you need, or do you use different types of rail cars?
So the bulk shipping that we do for wheat, barley, canola, soybeans is mainly done in rail cars in bulk. And so there was very little problems there this year. Both railways reported all-time high as far as tonnage that they moved, and it was mainly ag products. The real problem is containers. And some of our products that we grow, pulses, for example, peas, chickpeas, lentils, get shipped in containers. And there's a container shortage. And containers are tied up in ports. They're not getting unloaded. Full ones don't get off ships. Empty ones can't get into port because the port is jammed with full and empty containers. There's backlogs to the point where that industry, the container industry, is paralyzed.
Oh my gosh.
And that has partly to do with us not being able to get our parts to fix equipment. And in return, we can't ship our pulses over to Asia because a lot of them are shipped in containers. So the pulse industry is reeling a little bit. They also ship in bulk, and so that part of their market is okay. It's the container market that's in real trouble.
Okay, you've given me an asterisk here to do a follow-up on trying to figure out if that if there's a breakthrough that's imminent there. Have you read any analysis on that to come through with a solution
No.
for how to get things moving again? And I don't even know if it all just began with the Suez Canal backup, or was it the escalation of
No, I
transport?
think how it began, I don't know. It really all began with COVID, and then
Yeah.
people not being at work, and then it. One report I read in LA and the Pacific ports in the U.S. There's some bylaws there that don't allow container storage above 2 container high, and there's a real logistics problem that can be solved, but again, it would take some political will. And so there's a lot of finger pointing going back and forth between the governor, the president, and local municipalities saying, well, that's outside our wheelhouse. We can't move there because the state is saying one thing, the county is saying another thing, the federal government is trying to get it all moving, and nobody seems to say, hey, if we don't get this solved, we're in real big trouble.
All right, I'm going to make you
I'm
ag
sorry for
minister.
all the bad news.
I know I'm making you ag minister for the next 5 minutes, and you're going to tell us how to solve the problems in your industry.
no interest in running for political.
But what is your advice to government? What's your main takeaway about what you think governments need to do for your industry? It seems like there's just additional measures loaded up without really any acknowledgement of the consequences of it, number one, but also the no appreciation for the supply chain issues that you're facing, number two, and no regard for the incredible amount of innovation that's taking place in your industry. And I'm really struck by what you said as we were getting into this, that it's just like pasture land. It's just like the cattle grazing. You need animals working the soil to have healthy landscapes.
Mhm.
And it sounds like you need to have healthy farming operations to manage these landscapes properly as well.
Yeah.
Leaving it in fallow is not the way. If you're
No.
concerned about CO2 emissions, that's not the way to do it. But there seems to be a major disconnect. And I wonder if you had some advice for governments about what they should do. What would that be?
The main advice is, what is government's role within a country? Is it really to put up roadblocks within an industry that is working really well? For example, carbon tax on things we do on the farm, taking away fertilizer when we use it in a proper way, in a responsible way. It seems like they're putting up roadblocks that affect the sustainability of my farm. Don't do that. Don't put roadblocks in the way. We were doing fine. Canadian farmers at the forefront as far as producing grain. Go anywhere else in the world, and you see lots of problems. Go to Russia and see how farming works there. It's not as good as here in Canada. I'd actually say Australia is doing a great job. The US, really good job. And so why are we being picked on when we are technologically at the forefront? Why are we the easy target? So for governments need to actually tell the good news story that Canadian farmers are doing. We grow the best durum in the world, the best hard red spring wheat. We grow canola, which is the best vegetable oil available. So I mean, what more do they want? Now they want to curb that? Why? I ask you why. Because the average consumer will still want to go to the supermarket and say, hey, I just want there to be food on the shelf. And there will be food on the shelf. You can shut down all farming in Canada and there will be something to eat there. Not everybody will be able to afford it, but it will be there. So don't wreck a good thing. It's, people want our wheat, our high quality wheat. It's high in protein. To make flour in Asia, they look for our wheat. Ask in Japan what they think of Canadian wheat, and they go, oh, wow, it's the best, right? We bring it in, and we can mix it into our lower quality wheat and turn it into a flour that will make bread. We like their canola. Japan, one of our biggest canola customers. Incidentally, Europe is buying our canola after China stopped. And so stop playing politics with an industry that is doing so well in Canada.
That's such a good note to end on. I don't know if I've seen recent stats on this, but I remember from time to time there are polls that go out asking about the public's level of respect for
Right.
different industries. And politicians are down at the bottom, somewhere below used car salesmen. Farmers consistently are at the top. So you may be a small percentage, but you have the great esteem of Canadians. So thank you for the work that you do. And thanks for sharing some of the challenges that you're facing. Hopefully we can assist you in trying to at least raise the alarm about some of these issues and try to solve them. And I think you have affirmed my introduction of you. Thank you for being so knowledgeable about so many things. And thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Danielle. My pleasure.
That was Gunter Jochum. As I mentioned, he is the president of the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association. Hope you enjoyed that. When I talked to him yesterday, I knew we would be able to talk at length about these issues. And as normal, sorry, we end up finding more problems than we do find solutions. So I have a few of you who sent me notes in the chat and a couple of follow-ups that I'll have to do to get to the bottom of some of the issues that were raised today. But thanks for tuning in. We'll be back at it again next week. Once again, I'm Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group.